This is our Ruyer reading group. We're continuing our reading of Neofinalism, picking up from page 52 of the translation. So we started this chapter, the brain and the embryo, last time, I believe, or maybe 2 sessions ago, can't remember. Anyway, so this is a sort of a comparison I think he's made in some other places that we've seen between the development of the embryo in an animal, including humans. And learning, how the brain sort of transforms itself in learning a skill or a task or whatever. And one of the sort of key similarities between these two processes is the fact that you can't sort of presuppose that there's an existing structure that sort of guides the process. So like the embryo, like the development of the embryo is precisely the process through which the embryo develops its own structures, different organs and tissue types and so on. So you can't really assume that there's something already existing in the embryo that sort of makes the development happen in a certain way. And likewise in the process of learning. So of course, a human brain is already, very sort of complicated, and it has all kinds of structures that exist. But what you're doing when you say learn how you learn, I don't know, the times table or learn how to read or whatever, is your sort of acquiring a structure in your brain, or sort of like transforming yourself in such a way as to be able to perform a certain task. And Ruyer sort of he constantly argues against the idea that we can suppose that this learning process is sort of brought about by a pre-existing structure. This would be sort of like a mechanicist explanation of learning, and he instead wants us to understand learning as analogous to the embryo taking on structure, or structuring itself in a sense. So yeah, these are sort of like two analogous processes. So we should think of learning as analogous to the development of the embryo, rather than sort of like filling up boxes that already exist or something along those lines. I think the bit that we ended on last time was looking at so it's this structure of certain regions of the brain that have what's called a retinotopic map. So there are regions in the brain that have like a sort of mapping onto the retina, that you can say like this portion of the brain corresponds to this region of the retina, and you can sort of map out this region of the brain in terms of what portions of the retina correspond to what portions of that region. And that there are like a few different ones that, there's some that respond to like vertical lines in a certain region of the retina, and others that respond to horizontal lines, etc., or movement in that region. But what Ruyer points out is that this sort of correspondence has a kind of a strange form, in the sense that it's not like there's like one sort of wire going from one region of the retina to one region of the brain that would sort of like if you were making sort of an artificial detector system, that you want to have like, this detector will signal the presence of a vertical line in a certain region of an image, for example. You would sort of like have a direct connection between, say, this region of the camera, or the image, and then this region of the sort of detector system. You would just have like a sort of straightforward wire connecting one to the other. But in the way that the retinas of animals, including humans, work, there are all kinds of interconnections between the different areas. So it's not that there isn't sort of like a one-to-one correspondence where like there's just a single wire that connects a region of the retina to a region of the brain. Instead, you have all these sort of complicated cross connections that are hard to understand from a sort of very simplistic sort of engineering perspective. Like if you were building an edge detector, why would you sort of add all these unnecessary connections? And so what we're going to see as we continue to the next bit, this sort of seemingly unnecessary complication sort of suggests that the way that these regions of the brain are working is not quite as straightforward as like a sort of mechanicist edge detector system would work, or what we might think would be the case if this region were operating in that same way. Okay, so we can pick up from page 52 at the schema of these areas.
I can read. The schema of these areas, as well as of the retina, which has a very similar structure to a cortical area, can be figured as follows. And then there's a complex diagram that I honestly don't really understand. It's labeled anatomical end patterns and physiological end patterns. I'm just going to move on. It seems that this structure is meticulously designed to render the strict projections of ABCD. Okay, so these are these 4 labeled nodes at the top of the diagram onto alpha, beta, gamma, delta, which are these 4 labeled end patterns at the bottom. Okay, so it seems this structure is meticulously designed to render the strict projection of ABCD onto alpha, beta, gamma, delta impossible. And the reason he says that is that there are all these interconnecting kind of diagonal lines intervening in between the 4 nodes at the top of the diagram and the 4 end patterns at the bottom. In fact, the organism corrects this curious anatomy with complex and poorly understood physiological procedures. Summation, e.g. if B and C alone are excited, the neurons B, C, and beta, gamma receive more influx than the neurons AD and alpha, delta, and the resistance of synapses can be vanquished for beta, gamma, and not for alpha, delta. Temporal summation, rente de no, chronaxic accord or discord, Lapique, reciprocal inhibition, Gasser, and so on. Whether the organism goes about it in one way or another, the precision of the nervous operation is generally very superior to what we would expect based on the anatomic structure. But if it is true that cerebral equipotentiality is independent of association fibers, it is by contrast perfectly normal for the brain, the instrument of athematism that cannot be reduced to a chain of step-by-step causality, to operate according to physiological rather than anatomic relations. In reality, physiological connections can be established or broken with little energy. By contrast, anatomic connections would transform the brain into a pure machine or an irreversibly differentiated organ like the liver or the lung, in which embryonic equipotentiality is from then on quote-unquote expended in immutable structures. Psychic assemblies for a determined task which the intelligent act uses, but to which it is not reduced, would correspond to definite structures. They would be unable to constitute the auxiliaries of thematic behavior. Behavior would then become nothing more than the operation of automatic connections. Association fibers are thus neither the necessary nor the sufficient condition of equipotentiality. The physiological wiring of neural components corrects the preset nature of these neural networks. Far from constituting the condition of equipotentiality, a preset neural anatomy would in fact hinder it. In principle, equipotentiality is absolutely indifferent to the existence or non-existence of association fibers. These fibers affect only the method of reception or affection. The foveal part of the retina differs from the rest of the retina in that there are fewer lateral synaptic interconnections between the elements of radial conduction. Each cone seems to be in contact with a single bipolar cell. If the interconnections were the key to equipotentiality, then foveal vision would have to be stripped of all quote-unquote thematism, something that obviously contradicts the facts. In the case of a visual learning, the foveal vision is more precise by its technique than general vision, although it is no less capable of quote-unquote equivalence and quote-unquote transfer. The existence of association fibers, provided of course their closure or opening is controlled physiologically and is not anatomically irreversible, does not hinder equipotentiality any more than it conditions it. The association fibers that unite the occipital lobe to the temporal lobe probably allow some conjugated behaviors, but they do not effectively mix and mingle visual sensations and auditory sensations as ingredients. They remain as distinct from one another in consciousness as the optic details are distinct from the foveal vision. We observe the most striking contrast between the enormous intellectual deficits of dementia, where it is often impossible to detect the least macroscopic brain lesion, and the negligible or even null effects on intelligence proper of enormous lesions, not only of sensory areas, but of the frontal lobe, the presumed seat of symbolism-based behavior. The effect of the now common operation of prefrontal lobotomy is to bilaterally section a part of the fibers that unite the prefrontal lobe to the thalamus. Comparative trials done before and after the operation do not find any substantial intellectual deficit, probably due to an improvement in the affective state, decrease of tension and of affective anticipation, not of explosive affectivity. Some trials were even more successful, Freeman and Watts. Even in cases of apparent deficit, we realize on closer examination that the reduction bears on the aptitude of symbolico-affective quote-unquote assembly, on emotional perseveration, rather than on intelligence itself, Spearman's G factor. After the operation, the lobotomized patient remains just as capable of, quote, eduction of relations, or, quote-unquote, eduction of correlates, which, according to Spearman's thesis, represents general intelligence, and we might add the typical thematism of cerebral equipotentiality. So I'll stop there. As far as I understand it, seems like the basic idea here is that this kind of more complex and mediated connective relation in connective relations in the nervous system allows for, I guess, the kind of improvisation that he's been arguing is characteristic of these thematic behaviors, as opposed to like a rigid, input output system, so that if there's the A input, you always like sort of only the alpha output lights up. Instead, there are these more complex mediating processes that allow for, something like improvisation and recognition, the ability to recognize the same thing in different situations, or something like that.
Yeah, so going back to the diagram, so apologies to the people listening who maybe don't have the diagram in front of them. It's probably, that passage is probably pretty obscure. But I think just a sort of like the general idea of what's going on in this diagram, the main thing I think is that, the two sort of key properties that depicted in the diagram are, one, that the diagram has three layers. So there's an intermediate layer. So there's what he calls the starting pattern. So that you can think of this as like the pattern on the retina, like which cells in the retina are stimulated by light or a certain frequency of light or whatever. And then there's the output layer, or what he's here calling anatomical end patterns and physiological end patterns. So these are like regions in the brain that are that have this sort of correspondence with the retina. So the key factor here is that there's an intermediate layer between the two. So there isn't like a direct connection between this portion of the retina and this portion of a brain region, for example. And then secondly, the intermediate layer in itself wouldn't really do anything if the connections between the input layer and the intermediate layer were one-to-one, and then also the connections from the intermediate layer to the output layer were also one-to-one. It would just be sort of one link, just adding an extra link to this correspondence. What is noteworthy is that that is precisely not the case. So there are several inputs that feed into the same intermediate node, and then each intermediate node feeds into several output nodes. And so because of this, we have this more complicated interconnection between the different layers. And so we can't sort of suppose that there's a kind of like, if this set of input nodes are activated, then the sort of square recognizing region of the brain will be activated, or something simplistic like that. Instead, we have to take these patterns to be these sort of interconnections to be more complicated. And so he mentions there's different sort of proposals of how these connections might work. So things like summation. So like you could have one of these intermediate nodes might act by sort of taking in inputs from the different input nodes and summing them, and then if the sum is above a certain threshold, then that intermediate node will be activated, or it could be inhibition. So it could, like, this is something that maybe is, I think, a little bit counterintuitive, but you sometimes have like in the way nervous systems actually work physiologically. Sometimes one neuron acts by inhibiting another neuron, so it makes it harder for that second neuron to be activated. And so, like in I think some of the edge detection sort of systems work in something like this way, so that like if part of the visual field is has say a bright light in it, that it sort of inhibits the neighboring regions, so that if they don't have that same degree of brightness, it sort of heightens the contrast between the light region and the dark region. Yeah, and so like this is another sort of more complicated way that these different nodes can interact with each other, and you can think of like temporal structure, that like maybe this node activates only if there's like a sequence of a certain kind, that the intermediate node will activate only if a certain sequence of input nodes is activated in a certain order, and so on. So you can think of many complicated ways that you could connect all these different nodes to each other. And part of what the sort of value of doing things in this complicated way is that you can like sort of use the same hardware, like the same anatomical connections between the neurons, to perform lots of different operations without having to like, because the process of adding or removing connections between neurons is obviously very slow. It's not something that can happen in in real time as you're watching I don't know, a ball rolling down the hill or whatever, and sort of figuring out what's going on. Your sort of processing of what it is you're seeing that allows you to distinguish the ball from the hill that it's rolling down, and track the moving object as its location in your visual field changes, etc. All these sort of component processing tasks that have to happen for you to be able to understand what you're seeing. You obviously can't sort of rely on these anatomical, connection disconnection processes that might take like weeks or months to perform these tasks. And so there has to be more sort of flexibility that is reversible. So you have these connections already sort of pre-built, and then you can use them in different ways to perform different tasks. So this is like part of the, I guess, value of having these seemingly unnecessary complications in the way that these nodes are connected with each other, is that you can have the same connections be used to perform many different tasks. You can look at a scene, and you can identify the edges of objects. You can identify colors. You can sort of like taking in the same stimulation, same pattern of light on the retina. You can sort of identify different aspects of the scene. You can watch a video and pick out how many people there are, or you can look at the pattern of light against on the ground as the trees move or whatever. You can sort of focus on many different things, and all these things are probably happening sort of in parallel in the background to allow us to identify objects and understand the scene that we're seeing. And then as I mentioned in the chat here, there's a bit that didn't age particularly well about lobotomy and so on. So this was there was a kind of lobotomy fad, I think, around this time in the like mid 20th century, where it's pretty actually horrifying that people were doing these lobotomy, like performing lobotomies in like a dentist office kind of setting. Like there was not like a sort of like surgery, consultation and like deciding whether to do it or not. It was like, oh, you came in with like this, you have a headache, okay, we'll just do a lobotomy on you. So there were like many thousands of people that had these lobotomies performed on them with like very little knowledge about what exactly was going to be the result of the lobotomy, and like understanding sort of informed consent and all this stuff. And so in this text, he's suggesting that this lobotomy operation has little impact on the sort of performance of the patient on these sort of like IQ test type of tasks. I think that is probably more optimistic about lobotomies than anyone today would be. So some of the he's also in some of the other passages we've read suggested that like these sort of big lesions to where 20%, 30% or whatever of the cortex is destroyed have like little impact, and I think that also is overly optimistic. But what is sort of noteworthy is that there are of course many forms of dementia that don't where there's no sort of or there's no sort of gross lesion, there's no like big chunk of the brain that has been damaged in a way that sort of is immediately apparent. There's something about the way that the brain is functioning that it is like leading to cognitive problems in the person. They can't remember things, or they get confused easily, and they sort of forget what they're doing and so on. But it doesn't seem like that is a result of like some like very obvious damage. There's something like much more subtle that has gone wrong. And so he's taking this as a sort of sign that we shouldn't be thinking of the brain as it's functioning in healthy people as a sort of like pre-built set of components that are kind of like just sort of feeding into each other in the way that a machine would. It's clear that there's something more dynamic and sort of flexible that is happening in the healthy person that somehow has gone wrong in the person with dementia. That the sort of flexibility and adaptability is no longer there for whatever reason. I think one thing, like right at the end that he mentioned, so even I think maybe the specifics that he's talking about here maybe were not accurate, but I think it's a good sort of general argument is that so even if you do sort of so in the case of like a lesion, it could be lobotomy or result of a stroke or whatever, if you find that the patients who have undergone this lesion or who have experienced this lesion have lower performance on some sort of test that is testing a certain cognitive ability, that doesn't necessarily tell you that the damage to that region sort of brought about the lower performance because that region was sort of like responsible for performance of that cognitive task. So he suggests here that it could be that there's a sort of affective component to the lower performance. So like you can just imagine that if damage to a certain region makes people get bored more quickly or more easily, then they would probably have lower performance on an IQ test type of task where you're doing these sort of like arbitrary problems that don't have any sort of intrinsic significance or interests of their own. So if you just sort of get bored after a couple minutes and are not really paying attention anymore, you're likely to perform worse. But that doesn't mean that like the region that was damaged was sort of responsible for the kinds of arithmetic or geometric or word problems that are involved in a standard sort of IQ test. So yeah, it's the sort of observing that there is this difference of performance doesn't necessarily tell you that like the lesion is sort of that the area that is not affected by the lesion in the healthy subjects is sort of like responsible for that area. There are many other ways that a lesion could bring about a decline of performance without that area actually being sort of directly involved in performing that task in the healthy subject.
Yeah, I think, like you mentioned, parts of this section didn't age well. For me, there's so many things to address within this section, but I think as I understand it, the bigger point he's trying to make is simply this: what we might consider intelligence, or any behavioral output, or response to stimuli. It's not hard coded in the brain, in the anatomy. And I think that's a solid point.
Yeah, so I mean I don't think he would deny that there are things that probably do have a sort of mechanical type of structure. There's things like regulation of breathing or heartbeat or with things like that. That I mean, breathing you can to some extent control consciously. You can sort of make yourself breathe quickly or more slowly, but also it's something that you know do without thinking about it. So yeah, there are these sort of like very basic physiological functions that have that are sort of regulated by the brain that you know probably do have some sort of like pre-built circuit kind of structure, and it's probably a good thing that they do because we don't want to have to like learn how to breathe or learn how to make sure your heart keeps beating. It's something that of course we want to have happen without our having to think about it and learn how to do it and so on. But yeah, so it doesn't mean that these things don't exist. But what he's pointing to is that like a lot of our sort of performances, not even just like very sort of high level, creative things, writing a novel or whatever, but even just sort of basic things like, being able to identify where the coffee cup is on the table and, move your hand to pick it up. Like this is a very sort of trivial task for most people. But it does require a lot of it's very non-trivial to get like a robot to be able to do this, to identify an object based on receiving visual information, like sort of demarcating the coffee cup from the table behind it or under it or whatever, and then translating that to where is that coffee cup in space in relation to where my arm is now, and then moving your arm in the right way to traverse that distance, and then changing your grip in the right way to pick up the coffee cup, without spilling the coffee or breaking the handle or whatever. These are all like very complicated performances that, of course, we don't even think about doing. And of course, if you take like an infant, their ability to do these kinds of things is much lower than an adult. This is why, of course, babies are generally given like bottles with that you have to suck on to get the liquid out, because you can't trust them to hold the cup without spilling the liquid everywhere. So yeah, you have to learn how to do these things. And so this is like a sort of dynamic process through which you sort of build a structure within yourself that is sort of reliably able to move your hand to a desired location in space, or to detect certain types of objects, like coffee cups are familiar objects that you often see on tables, and you can identify them very easily and so on. So yeah, all these different like performances that that we are like familiar with are things that we have to sort of build into ourselves by trying to manipulate objects. And of course, this is something babies and toddlers love doing, picking up the thing and dropping it and seeing what happens. Yeah, just messing around with things until you sort of get a sense of how they behave when you do something to them. And as you sort of do this kind of manipulation and wander around the world, hopefully with someone making sure that you are not going to hurt yourself, then you sort of acquire this familiarity with objects and how they behave, that allows you to do all these things without having to sort of calculate what angle your arm has to be at to grasp the coffee cup and so on. And this is something that I think we talked about it probably in the cybernetics book, about how like some earlier attempts at artificial intelligence type things or robotics that relied on sort of like listing a bunch of like facts, like you'd build a robot arm and you would say, okay, like build in the dimensions of the arm and like the angles of joints that it could rotate, and like the motor and all these things, and then sort of like trying to program based on like geometrical, like a sort of geometrical representation of space, like you'd say like move this joint X degrees and then move this joint Y degrees and so on. This is like extremely arduous to actually do as like a sit down and sort of write a program to make the arm perform a certain task. And it's also very sort of brittle in the sense that like if say you have like a factory robot arm that's sort of like, I don't know, welding a spot on a car or whatever as it goes along, if the sort of alignment between the robot arm and the conveyor belt, say, is like off by a degree or two, then it'll just weld the wrong spot. It'll just keep moving in accordance with this this preset pattern, but the car is not where it's supposed to be, and so it's welding the wrong spot. And so like a small variation in the environment that this arm is operating in will make the whole sort of program useless. Which of course is not how like human behavior. Like if you had a human welding the spot on the car, they could very easily respond to the conveyor belt being at a slightly different angle and just move where their arm is and weld the right spot. And then even like lots of other animals are capable of responding in a flexible way to differences in their environment, that like the lighting is a bit different, or the prey animal is a little bit bigger than expected or whatever. Yeah, they're capable of adapting to these changes. And what has turned out to be pretty much essential for any like more, I guess, like flexible kind of robotics that are robots that can navigate a sort of wild environment. So not just like a robot arm fixed in place in a factory where everything is controlled, but like moving around in the world, climbing hills, walking on icy surfaces, etc. These kind of robots have always required some sort of machine learning training process to sort of figure out how to control the robot limbs. Like if you were to try to, program, one of these like horrifying robot dogs based on like, okay, move this joint by X degrees and then, move this other joint by Y degrees, etc. Like, yeah, it would be this like monstrous task. And then as soon as you move the robot to a slightly different kind of surface where, the rotation of a joint by a certain amount would result in a different movement of the whole body, then like this walking program that you had spent so many years developing would be useless. So yeah, it's only like even with these what seems like a fairly simple task of like operating a robot body, to make it like even minimally flexible to be able to respond to different surfaces and still maintain stability. You essentially have to rely on some kind of learning process, which of course is very different than a human learning process, or even a dog learning how to walk and so on. But it's sort of it's more like the way that a human would learn than it is like sort of feeding a pre-built program of geometrical rotations of joints. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Organelles, would you like to read from the ablation of frontal lobes?
Sure, yeah. The ablation of frontal lobes naturally engenders serious deficits, but does not cause dementia or radical amnesia. Unilateral ablation is tolerated without marked psychological disturbances. Bilateral ablation destroys, much more severely than lobotomy, the capacity for symbolic assembly and for behavior that is seriated according to a plan. It destroys the auxiliaries that are indispensable to the action of the G factor, but as far as we can tell from a small number of cases, it does not destroy the G factor itself. The experiments of bilateral lobotomy on apes, Bianchi, Jacobson, lead to the same conclusion. The quote-unquote assembly, the set indispensable to deferred reactions, is disturbed. The animal is very easily distracted from a task it has to retain in its consciousness. More easily perturbed is the architecture of a plurality of quote-unquote assemblies. The animal is incapable of planning its behavior. It can no longer organize its behavior in a well-defined series of actions. Because it is very difficult to experimentally distinguish between animal intelligence proper and an auxiliary as essential to intelligent behavior as the retention and seriation of tasks, it is difficult to reach a conclusion on the role of prefrontal lobes in intelligence and memory. But, at any rate, it seems that the facts do not support the assertion that the frontal lobes are the seat of intelligence. It is enough to browse through the accounts of Kohler, Guillaume, and other experimenters to realize that nearly all of the problems of intelligence posed to animals implicate a correct seriation of tasks. Some privileged cases allow us to distinguish, in the reasons for the animal's failure, between what is due to a lack of intelligence and what is due to an emotional accident that demolishes the edifice of quote-unquote assemblies for the undertaken task. e.g., the failure of Chica as a result of a noise that frightens it and makes it reverse its efforts in an absurd way. Theoretically, then, the problem of the exact role of frontal lobes in intelligent behavior is accessible to experimentation, even if the limited number of experiments has not been entirely conclusive. It may now be assumed that the frontal cortex is in the service of consciousness, memory, and intelligence, but it is not, in its general structure and in the architecture of its association fibers, a kind of instrument for becoming intelligent. That dementia is produced much more easily by disturbances that affect neural cells, intoxications, various degenerations, than by massive lesions of the brain indicates at least that cerebral equipotentiality, as it appears in intellectual thematism, is due to the nature of the living tissue rather than to the massive architecture of the brain as an organ designed for perception and action on the external world. Just as cerebral equipotentiality should not be explained by neural connections, which are, on the contrary, in its service, so embryonic equipotentiality cannot be explained by physicochemical factors. We can be brief on this subject because we have discussed the question at length in a previous work. When discussing genetics later on, we will come back to the logical impossibility concealed in theories like that of T.H. Morgan and de Kock, with claim to explain the embryological formation through the action of a substance or a chemical on genes. So-called chemical organizers, spilled out by genes or by embryonic organizing centers, are ordinary chemicals. They can be construed as triggers, or rather as invokers of formative psychonemic themes, which are summoned by them to pass into the plane of space-time. But it is simply absurd to turn them into the causes of the complex structures of the invoked organs. These substances act in the manner of smells that invoke memories in humans or instincts in animals. They put the embryo in circuit with mnemic themes that once, quote unquote, invoked determination, pass into the actual differentiation. The chemical theory of organization is doubly absurd, for even if we concede that an ordinary chemical can be the cause of a complex structure, it cannot be its cause in the manner that is in fact typical of embryonic development. The development always goes from the abstract to the concrete. The termination and the initial differentiations can only have abstract expressions. Axis of symmetry, dorsoventral axis in general, cephalic regions, caudal region, somites in general, limb buds. As psychological observations demonstrate, this is how the sexual instinct invoked by chemical means, hormones, goes from the abstract to the concrete, from an undifferentiated stage to a more differentiated one, in a development similar to the one that orients the progressive change of tubers and primitive genital folds in male and female organs, or that transforms into a hand or a foot the primitive palate where the future fingers are, in the beginning, buds similar to one another. I'll stop there. I think for me, what's important here is really just that he points out that behavior in general, rather than being something that might say be coded in the genes, and that as an organism develops, that behavior emanates out from that code, um, uh, is absurd, and that rather that this anatomy is functioning more as a sort of a relay between what is allowing for that dynamic interaction in the environment for the organism, and that if you do begin to say ablate certain more or less randomly, like he says, with I assume, like with degeneration of different cells, that ability for the brain to act as that relay is diminished, versus like very specific lesions causing very specific deficits. Yeah.
Yeah, so when he's talking about embryology here, so he's pushing back against the idea that some of the I'll back up a little bit. So in the development of the embryo, there are certain chemicals that are play a role in the development, where, like, for example, sort of like the head to tail direction in the embryo corresponds to a gradient of a certain chemical, that like the concentration of this chemical is higher at the head end or the tail end versus the other end. Um, and sometimes this is sort of presented as like this chemical, causes a region to develop into the head or whatever. And he's sort of pushing back against this sort of presentation of development because, of course, this like chemical on its own doesn't really have anything to do with forming a head. Like if you took some of this chemical and poured it on a rock, the rock would not sort of develop a head. It's only because the embryo itself is capable of undergoing this kind of transformation that this concentration gradient sort of corresponds to the head to tail direction in the embryo as it develops. So this sort of like very mechanistic presentation that like this chemical causes the formation of a head. This sort of like this kind of oversimplifies the developmental process, and likewise in the case of learning, this idea that like so one like say like I don't know, a certain type of stimulus would cause a certain behavior to happen by this sort of like physical operation on the brain. This is also an oversimplification because we have to instead see the process through which the brain sort of transforms itself in learning as analogous to the way that the embryo transforms itself in response to this chemical gradient, for example. So there's like formation or sort of like this progressive differentiation of behavior in learning, in the same way that there's this progressive differentiation of the embryo that develops into an adult organism. So you have like the embryo develops starting with these like very abstract structures, like the head to tail direction, or left and right differentiation, and so on. And it sort of like gradually specifies each of these. So like the left and right sides each develop limbs, and those limbs eventually specialize as a foot versus a hand, for example. So it starts out from a very abstract sort of differentiation of front and back, left to right, etc. And then those partially differentiated sides of the embryo then undergo further differentiation. And so, it goes from this abstract towards finally the concrete organism where all the parts are differentiated. And so likewise, in the case of learning, we start with a kind of abstract sort of general grasp of like, there is an object in front of me or whatever, something very, very abstract. And then we only over time come to sort of differentiate the situation where we can distinguish, maybe different types of flowers. For example, if you are someone who like, spends a lot of time learning about plants, you acquire the ability to distinguish them from each other, based on how they look. And so you're going from this very abstract like object presentation situation to, okay, this is a plant, and then maybe specializing more and more until you can identify, oh, this is like this type of orchid that is from this region and whatever. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Right, okay, I can read this one. So strictly speaking, embryonic equipotentiality is not a quote-unquote property of material tissues and their chemistry, any more than cerebral equipotentiality is a property of the material cortex and its interconnections. The general notion of equipotentiality designates the fact that the area at issue can be put in circuit with this or that theme, relative to which it is still indifferent, and that the theme can gain a foothold indifferently on this or that large or small part of the embryonic or cortical area. Relative to the tissue, equipotentiality represents something negative, not positive. And the notion was very muddled by the expressions quote-unquote real potentiality and quote-unquote total potentiality that were often employed simultaneously with it. Real potentiality designates what the territory really becomes, and total potentiality all that the experimentation on other individuals of the species show that it can become. The equipotential territory is not at once itself and something else. It is not yet what it will become when it is put in circuit with this or that mnemic theme. At a given moment, I have a memory that quote unquote occupies my consciousness and my brain activity as well. But I could easily have had another if a different quote unquote invoker had intervened to put me in circuit with it. This does not mean, however, that my consciousness and my brain contained both and all of the others, quote unquote, potentially. The Aristotelian expression is meaningless in this case, and contrary to what Driesch believes, has nothing to do with Aristotelian notions. What is at stake is a possibility of placement in circuit with various themes that are not in space-time. This symmetrical argumentation about the primary character of equipotentiality in both cases, against the connectionist hypothesis and against the physical-chemical hypothesis, is reinforced by its very symmetry. If the connections or gradients of substance were not simple accessory means, it would be difficult to understand how embryological and cerebral phenomena could exhibit such kinship. These means do not play the same role. The quote-unquote connectionist means in neural organs are subordinated to the tasks of reception of sensory patterns and motor effection, which lead to well-localized terminal paths. The embryo's physical-chemical means are subordinated above all to the tasks of coordination, synchronization, and distribution in development. In the egg or the embryo, which is at first totally equipotential, except in species where a very precocious determination masks this character, the determination distributes this equipotentiality into more limited territories, which develop from then on with relative autonomy, as revealed by the experiments of delayed graft, where the transplant develops quote-unquote unintelligently according to its origin, herkunftsgemäß, and no longer according to its new place. In normal development, the chemical means intervene to guarantee spatially and temporally the coordination of territories. I read the next one as well. Precisely because it is a matter of an auxiliary technique, accidents can take place which lead to results similar to those of delayed grafts in experimentation. These accidents are called monstrosities, and A. Wolf has compellingly shown that experimental embryology illuminates the majority of natural monstrosities. Just as the ordinary psychological memory as well as the instinctive memory can be scrambled with abnormal signals, so normal development is scrambled by accidents in physical or chemical relations between the territories. For instance, if we damage a localized region of the embryo, which, as a result, undergoes an arrest in development, quote, this elimination entails as a secondary outcome the coming together of territories that are not contiguous in normal evolution, unquote. If the damaged region is axial, the two lateral primordia will enter into contact, and if at the moment of contact they are determined thematically without yet being differentiated, they will fuse together in the same way that two adjoined urchin eggs can fuse into a single egg. This is the case of cyclopes and, cymeleons. I don't know if this is a word in English. Anyway, monsters with only a single lower limb. Equipotentiality, which should have been quote-unquote distributed into two equal territories, remains undivided. The case of experimental or spontaneous cyclopia and cymelia weighs heavily in favor of the primary character of equipotentiality because it is for lack of an axial organ interposed as an obstacle that they spontaneously play out and lead to a single organ. Spontaneous or experimental half-double monsters, shaped as a Y or a lambda, illustrate a perfectly analogous phenomenon and prove that the mechanical or chemical means of numerical individualization come only after a unity that is given first. It would be contradictory to explain this unity by the very means that, on the contrary, limit or distribute it. The monstrosities prove in their own way the finalist surveying unity, whose effort is deceived by causes that it is tempting to say, quote, are independent of its will, unquote. The monstrous embryo is never an arbitrary form. Quote, the malformations are secondary modifications of a primordium that is first constituted according to the normal mode, unquote. So again, he's sort of building on this analogy between what he's calling equipotentiality in the case of embryology and in the case of the brain, as it learns to perform different tasks. So in the case of embryology, so we talked about this, I think, in a previous session, but equipotentiality is just the recognition or the expression of the fact that different parts of the embryo can develop, or a single part of the embryo could develop in different ways depending on how it relates to other parts of the embryo and other circumstances. So this is sort of like one of the sort of classic experiments that demonstrates this, is that you can take it was like a tadpole or the egg of a frog. You can sort of cut off left and right parts and swap them. If you do it early enough in the development, the tadpole develops with the left and right limbs in the right places, even though what eventually developed into the left limb came from the right side of the body and vice versa. But it turns out that if you do this operation later, after a certain sort of critical point, that the development proceeds based on where that portion of the embryo came from, as opposed to where it now is. So the region of the embryo that is now on the right side develops into a left leg, and vice versa. So yeah, the part that you took from the left side still develops into a left leg, even though it's now on the right side. So yeah, it depends on when in the process of development you sort of perform this operation. So and interestingly, this happens before there's like visible sort of differentiation of that region into a leg. So at some point there's a determination that this region is now sort of fixed as a left side region. And then only afterwards does that region develop into a leg. And so you can perform this swapping operation before any leg is visible, but it might still be after this determination of left versus right has happened. And then yeah, so what he's sort of pointing out here is that in the case of embryology, the fact that if you do these kinds of interventions early enough, that the organism still develops normally, this shows that there can't have been some sort of like pre-built structure in the embryo that sort of ensured that that this region would develop into a left leg, because the region that would normally have developed into a left leg now develops into a right leg after this intervention. So there has to be some sort of more global sort of direction of the developmental process. It has to involve some kind of relationship of this part to other parts, as opposed to like this part is kind of like intrinsically assigned to become a left leg. And so likewise in the case of learning, in the case of the brain that undergoes development, we can't sort of assume that a certain region of the brain is sort of intrinsically assigned to perform a certain task, because we find that in cases where there's a lesion, someone has a stroke, for example, they might lose a certain capacity, like maybe they can't speak initially, but then after months and maybe some sort of directed training or therapy, they eventually are able to sort of relearn how to speak, and it might not be exactly as clear as they spoke before, but it's perfectly comprehensible. So somehow the remaining regions of the brain have enough flexibility that they can sort of take on this task of controlling the speech organs that without the stroke or without this lesion they would never have been assigned to do. But yeah, there's maybe not complete. He might be, I think, maybe exaggerating the extent to which there is this like equipotentiality in the brain that it's not the case that any region can do any task, which is sort of the vibe that he's presenting here. But it certainly is the case that regions that normally would not be involved in doing certain things can sort of given damage to other regions or some other sort of unforeseen circumstance, those different regions can take on responsibility for tasks that they normally would not be involved in.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think kind of what you pointed out there at the end. I mean, the big thing I see him pointing out here is just that there's this kind of interplay between kind of a malleable openness and then a fixed aspect, like in embryonic development and in learning, especially in embryonic development, though. You pass that threshold to where that open aspect of the development does become more fixed. But like you said, I think he's allowing for that to remain open in learning and in the brain, to a greater degree. I kind of appreciate that. if we had read this 20 or 30 years ago, we would have read this in a much different context. Before, like, I think we take it for granted now, but like even just 20 years ago, the idea of neuronal plasticity was, I mean, not many people accepted that, that was the case. It was thought that the brain developed, it hardwired, and once a neuron was born, that was it. There was no more, there were no neuronal stem cells, so to speak, which now has been shown as well. I think that that's interesting that he was seeing this so long before, it was kind of accepted, scientifically, that this could be the case. But I think, like you said, still right now, it might be argued that he's still allowing for maybe too much openness. But I don't know. I think he might be onto something. This is kind of a different, subject, but I'm very dismissive of a lot of these, brain scan studies, like fMRI studies and everything, that show this region is responsible for this, and things like that. But I kind of like this. I really appreciate what he's doing here, allowing for this malleable, creativity in how the brain functions.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe one sort of like good example of this kind of thing that we talked about, I think maybe a couple weeks ago, is the sort of reading region in the brain that, like, so if you look at people who grow up in a variety of different cultures, but that all share the fact that they have some sort of writing system that is in regular use, that there tends to be a lot of the same regions that are appear to be active, on a fMRI scan, while the person is reading. And yeah, so as I was like explaining last time, if you sort of just naively took the results of this experiment, and said, oh, you would just sort of say like, oh, there's like a specialized reading region of the brain that, like, this region is sort of like assigned for reading. But of course, we know that writing only emerged something like 5,000 years ago, and anatomically modern humans have existed for something like 300,000 years. So the vast majority of our, and then of course, there were various other organisms of the genus Homo before that. So millions of years of evolution in which there was nothing resembling writing, and then hundreds of thousands of years of more or less modern humans that also had no writing. So there's it's pretty clear that there would not have been evolutionary time to have like a specialized reading region emerge in the last 5,000 years. Yeah, so what this shows is that sort of the fact that it's in a given environment, a given region of the brain, like, regularly turns out to be involved in performing a certain task, doesn't necessarily mean that there's a sort of like predestination of this region of the brain for this task. If that person, or if that organism is developing in a different environment. So obviously humans who grew up in environments where there was no writing, would have used that region of the brain for some other task. Who knows what it was involved in, 100,000 years ago or whatever. But presumably that region wasn't just sort of like sitting there blank and not doing anything for many thousands of years, just in case someone invented writing later on. So we, of course, only examine, like, when we do fMRI studies or other types of studies of human brains, and then also other animals' brains, we're only ever examining these organisms in a sort of restricted set of environments out of all the imaginable environments. Like, all the humans that we've examined have grown up in a gravitational field where there's like an obvious up-down direction. So if if humans someday grow up on a space station, what would their brain look like? How would that affect the way that they develop? Who knows? Or there's any number of different sort of alternate environments you could imagine someone growing up in, and presumably their brains would develop in different ways that we probably can't even really foresee how that would happen. and things that might seem like very sort of fixed or like sort of predetermined in our brains might turn out to not develop that way in this other very different environment. Yeah, so it's very hard to sort of parse out what is sort of like a fixed program or a fixed developmental program in the brain versus what is like a constant feature of the environment in which the brains that we examine are developing. Yeah, so this is sort of like maybe with a little bit less so he's writing in a time when there's much less known about how how brains develop, how they function in an adult organism, etc. But I think even now we could still say there's a lot of sort of uncertainty about what a brain developing in a very different environment would look like, as opposed to the brains that we examine that are all developing in environments that have certain constant features, like something like the gravitational field of the Earth being sort of constant in the development of human brains, for example.
The point he made about monstrosities in this section, at least I took him to be arguing that, developmental issues often don't produce just like noise or, completely random or like incoherent shapes, but produce something that is, semi-viable or viable in a different way. And it made me think of some of the experiments Michael Levin has performed. He seems to always be like causing flatworms to grow multiple heads or strange shaped heads. I think there was some experiment where they induced the growth of a functioning eye on like the leg of a frog, something along those lines. But that seems to support Ruyer's point that, there's this thematic development that gets triggered. And it can be, it can sort of go off the rails or like happen in the wrong place, but it is clearly tending toward a viable unity. Will sort of do the best it can to achieve that unity, even when the development is off track.
Yeah, I know there have been some experiments with like seeing how plants will grow in like on a space station, for example. Like of course, in normal circumstances, the plant would grow where there's a clear gravitational direction of up and down. But on a space station, there's the gravity that is sort of present is much weaker, and so the plant will develop in this much less, I guess, vertically linear pattern. And I think there was also, if I remember correctly, there was an experiment with spiders to see like how they would build their webs when there's no obvious up and down. I don't remember what any of the results of these things were, but yeah. So obviously, spiders until the 20th century only ever developed and started making webs in an environment where there was a clear up and down sort of gradient in the environment. And so yeah, this is sort of like a fixed background condition of the spider environment. And so there was, I guess, no sort of like plan, if you want to put it in those words, for like what a spider should do in an environment with no up and down. And so yeah, but the spider is still sort of improvising, I guess, is doing something like what it would normally do, but adapting to this circumstance where there's no up and down, and that might produce something like a monstrous web in whatever sense, in the same way that the embryo, developing when, in this like environment where something has been, ablated, or there's been some sort of intervention by the surgeon or the experimenter. Yeah, in this sort of like abnormal environment with this intervention, the embryo still sort of, tries, in scare quotes, tries to develop in its normal sense, except that, the results of the development, after this intervention, it produces this, quote unquote monster, with a single eye or whatever. Okay, so maybe we can go on. Maybe we'll just read one more section and discuss, and then end there, if that works for everyone.
Is it my turn to read again? I don't remember.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Are we at in the order of behavior?
Yes.
Okay. In the order of behavior, the quote-unquote means, the neural connections cannot provoke the same kind of accident as physicochemical means in ontogenesis. But like all techniques, they can provoke other analogies, as when a ring in the chain of means is falsely called upon and triggers meaningless results. To find examples ad libitum, it is enough to open not a treatise on psychiatry, since psychogenic or humoral disturbances are certainly much more frequent in this domain than neural disturbances, but a treatise on neurology, paresthetic sensations, synapses and synesthesia, illusions of amputees, hyperalgesia, various agnosia, I think it should say agnosias, it says agonsias, and apraxias, auras, hallucinations, deliriums, non-psychogenic and non-humoral anxiety or euphoria, and so on. Despite the clear contrast between the two great means in the service of embryonic equipotentiality and cerebral equipotentiality, the organism has to pass from one to the other in the course of development. A chemical triggers the formation of the neural plate, and the nervous system then uses the neural connections and switches, aiguillage, in its operation. As we know, the organism never abandons the first means, even in the domain of behavior, because in the adult, the hormonal regulation that prolongs the action of embryonic organizers is essential not only for physiological operation, but for psychological life itself. The pituitary gland is a nervous organ at the same time as it is a gland with internal secretion. The sympathetic system functions in a semi-chemical way by releasing adrenaline, acting more or less diffusely. It is thus an invoker as much as a trigger, although their general thematism has certainly nothing to do with substances or spatiotemporal structures in the organism. The majority of instincts are subjected at once to humoral conditions and to neural conditions. And we can deceive an instinct or render it quote-unquote monstrous by acting on either of these conditions. We can deceive an animal by appealing with a trick to instinctive nausea that, without being materially inscribed in its nervous system and even without presupposing its integrity, presuppose all the same a certain operation of sensory nerves, artificial light to accelerate egg-laying, decoys and snares for hunting and fishing, mannequins for artificial insemination are examples. In the same way that we can deceive an instinct with humoral alterations and transform in their behavior as well as in their organization, genetic roosters into chickens with estrogen, or genetically female guinea pigs into male guinea pigs with testosterone. But researchers have managed to grasp the facts more closely and to uncover, in some privileged cases, the passage from chemical means to connectionist means. If we graft, for example, Harrison, Detweiler, Weiss, a batrachian limb bud in an abnormal position, the grafted limb seems to draw toward it the medullary nerves that normally innervate it. If the grafted bud is already quote-unquote determined with respect to its axes, its direction of bending after growth will be Herkunftgemäß, the original direction. If we graft it upside down, its bending will be quote-unquote absurd relative to its new place. One foot will bend when the other indigenous foot bends, but it will bend in reverse relative to the host organism. This proves that whether it is upside down or in the right position, the grafted foot, in becoming functional, attract the nerves that correspond respectively to the extensor and flexor muscles. These latter were already determined as such embryologically by the induction they underwent before transplantation, very likely a chemical induction. We are thus forced to conclude that the neural connections follow in a docile way the quality of the muscles to be innervated. This is what P. Weiss expresses picturesquely when he says that everything that takes place as if each muscle knew its name, muscle name theory. The neural connections appear at their rank in the cascade of determinations. They are produced according to the general theme and the proper sense of organs to be innervated. The chemical inductors or organizers serve to regulate the distribution of the themes of development. The neural connections obey in their turn the induced quality of the territories, to the point of persevering in the accidental or experimental monstrosity and rendering it definite. In such cases, we uncover the passage from theme to quote-unquote consolidated structure. If the adult organism seems at times akin to a machine and in fact functions partially like a machine, it is a machine that has constructed itself. Obviously, the self-construction cannot be understood unless we start from a kind of self-survey of the machine's structure at all of its stages. Self-survey is, as we will see, another way of denoting and defining equipotentiality. The industrial construction of the steam engine rests on human consciousness, the domain of self-survey whose objective manifestation is the equipotentiality of the cortex, which extends embryonic equipotentiality. The mechanical, quote-unquote, step-by-step bonds of the machine rest finally on the primary self-bonding of the embryo. Chemical means and connectionist means an internal circuit organization, industrial means an external circuit manufacturing. These subordinate techniques of organization and behavior presuppose a primary mode of unity by self-survey.